Welcome to 6 Degrees of Wiki, a podcast where two sisters find the 6 degrees of separation between Wikipedia articles that don't seem to have anything in common. I'm Rosanna.
And I'm Nikki. Today we'll fall into a Wikipedia spiral where we have just 6 rounds to figure out how the first degree could possibly be connected to the last, while learning all sorts of peculiar facts along the way. Let's get started. Today, we were spiraling from the Tulsa race riot to Damsel in distress. So I chose the starting degree for one of the same reasons Rosanna did Aretha Franklin last episode, because February is Black History Month, and the Tulsa race riot is a very disturbing, yet I think really important piece of history that has been just systematically erased from a lot of history books. And I think that it needed a little bit of publicizing. So, Rosanna, what do you think about... Well, I know you don't really know what the Tulsa race riot was.
Well, I've never heard of it, so...
That is not surprising.
Yeah, it's probably something that is important to talk about.
A huge number of people have not heard about this, including people in Tulsa not that long after the riot itself.
Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never even heard of it. I mean, it sounds terrible. Anytime race riot.
Yes. Anything about the last degree?
Well, to be honest, it seems pretty frivolous compared to the first degree. So, not sure how you're going to get there. Hopefully it'll have an uptick as we go.
Let's hope so. Now, I will start with a disclaimer here for people listening with their kids or kids listening. This first degree does have a lot of pretty tough situations, and I do recommend parents that you talk to your kids about racism and just things that happened in the distant past, even in the recent past, before you necessarily listen to this whole thing and maybe get some shocking information about things that actually happened. Round 1. The Tulsa race riot is an actual riot that took place in 1921, and there were mobs of whites that attacked black residents in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Damsel in distress is a classic theme in world literature and art, and video games and film too, usually involving a beautiful, naive woman rescued by a knight. Rosanna, do you see anything that these two items have in common?
Well, for one thing, I was surprised to hear the year, 1921, because when you hear race riot, you, of course, think the 60s.
Yeah.
I think it would be insulting to compare the strife of African Americans during race wars with a damsel in distress trope. However, both are distressing.
Yes.
So, my connection is distress.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will agree that this is distressing. So let's learn more about the Tulsa race riot. It's considered one of the worst incidents of racial violence in the United States in its history.
How have I never heard of this?
You're going to find out why.
Okay. In
a neighborhood called Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it happened. Took place between May 31st and June 1st, 1921. First, I'm going to give you some factors that led to the social climate that encouraged this to happen in the first place. Oklahoma in 1921, it was really tense. The racial climate there was very, very tense. It was during Prohibition. Lawlessness was pretty high at that point. It was a few years after World War I ended. There were a lot of ex-servicemen competing for jobs in a city with high unemployment, a lot of these being black men. Civil War was still in living memory. So was slavery. So there were plenty of former slaveholding families that lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan had a resurgence, gained a whole bunch of members. There was one estimate that put the percentage of members there as 3,200 people out of 72,000, so 4% of the population were considered to be members of the KKK.
That's disgusting.
So pretty bad.
Yeah.
And they were just gaining members during this time, too. Tulsa was also a booming oil city. It surprisingly supported a large number of affluent and educated professional black people, which didn't sit very well with a lot of whites who were living in poverty there. There was also newly created state legislature that was passing racial segregation laws, like the Jim Crow laws you've probably heard of. The state was pretty new, and one of its first orders of business was to segregate its citizens. There were also voter registration rules that effectively kept blacks from voting. They couldn't serve on juries or in local office, and this was enforced by whites until after the passage of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Whoa.
1965.
Wow.
This happened in 1921. Also, lynchings were common, which was just an effort by whites to assert and maintain white supremacy.
That's terrible.
So here is what happened in the Tulsa race riot. It started over Memorial Day weekend. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator, at the Drexel building. He was taken into custody. We don't know to this day what exactly happened. There were obviously some very conflicting stories about what happened. At 4 p.m., the Tulsa Tribune, which was one of the two white-owned papers published in Tulsa, broke the story with the headline, quote, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator. Alleged incident." Now, here's the thing. This particular paper, there is no copy of it that we have left. We can't actually prove that that headline is true. This is what was reported later as the headline.
Really?
It isn't even found on microfiche. Like, somebody went and destroyed all this stuff. Very purposeful. This was not an accident that we don't have this proof anymore.
I mean, if you have to destroy, you know you're wrong.
Exactly, yeah. Also, according to some witnesses, the same edition of this newspaper included a warning of a potential lynching of Rowland, called, quote, "To lynch Negro tonight," end quote. And we've talked about yellow journalism before and sensationalist headlines. These are definitely those. They sound like commands instead of reporting of something that happened. They're just inflaming the racial tensions already happening there. So by that night, several hundred white people had gathered outside the courthouse, looking like a lynch mob.
Mm-hmm.
A group of 50 to 60 armed black men rushed to the police station where Rowland was being held to support the sheriff because he was having some trouble keeping these people out. By this time, 1,000 white people were gathered. And when they saw these armed men, they went and started collecting their guns. So really not great. Now, by this time of night, there were up to 2,000 white people outside of the courthouse. According to witnesses, a white man from this crowd supposedly told one of the black men to surrender his pistol. This man refused. A shot was fired. We don't know who shot this first shot. Also, it may have been accidental. We don't know. Or maybe it was meant as a warning. Either way, it started the exchange of gunfire in this crowd. Shots were fired. 12 people were killed. 10 white people, 2 black people. So, news of these deaths spread throughout the city very quickly, and more violence just exploded in Tulsa. The National Guard was deployed to corral the mob. Really, what they did was protect the white districts next to Greenwood, and they arrested black people. There were thousands of white people rampaging through Greenwood, the black neighborhood, during the night and the next day, killing men and women, burning and looting stores and homes. More National Guard troops arrived in the morning and finally quelled the riot after just a mess. Now, I'll tell you this. The neutrality of this article is disputed, which I'm not surprised about.
Yeah.
It's also really hard to figure out exactly what happened because so much of the proof has been destroyed over time. Here's some of the numbers from the Tulsa race riot. More than 6,000 black Greenwood residents were arrested and detained at 3 local facilities.
Wow.
There's no number for the number of white people, which makes me think
Less?
that number was probably close to 0.
Yeah. So unfair.
About 10,000 black people were left homeless after this. Property damage then amounted to more than $1.5 million in real estate and $750,000 in personal property. Today's money, that's $32 million.
Whoa.
More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals. And while the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially recorded 36 dead, the American Red Cross declined to provide an estimate. The state commission re-examined events in 2001 and reported that they estimated 100 to 300 African Americans were killed during the riot.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really bad.
By June 6th, and this took place on May 31st and June 1st, so a week later, the Associated Press reported that a Citizens Public Safety Committee had been established. Guess who were members of the safety committee? 250 white men who vowed to protect the city and put down any more disturbance.
Wow.
If that is not a racist statement, I don't know what is. There was an investigation and a grand jury. In the end, the violence from the riot was all attributed to the black mobs.
Oh my God.
If you remember from some of the facts I told you earlier, blacks could not serve on juries. So no wonder a jury of 12 white people said that it was all the black people's fault. This is just insane. There were a whole bunch of survivors that just left Tulsa completely, and I don't blame them. And black and white residents who stayed were silent for decades about the violence and the terror and the losses from this riot. It was mostly omitted completely from local, state, and national histories, just left out in the first place.
It's horrible.
Yeah. And there were some notes in the article about how people who tried to publicize it were silenced. In 1996, 75 years after the riot, there was a bipartisan group that formed the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot of 1921. They were appointed to investigate the events, interview survivors, hear testimony from the public, and prepare a report of events. They tried to do more public education about the events as part of this process. 75 years later, a lot of people were dead that had experienced it. The final report came out in 2001, and that said that the city had conspired with the mob of white citizens against black citizens. It also recommended reparations to survivors and their descendants. And what came of that were some scholarships for descendants of survivors, encouragement of economic development of Greenwood, the neighborhood, and the development of a memorial park in Tulsa to the riot victims. Which, those are all great, but that doesn't sound like much to make up for what happened. So that was the Tulsa race riot.
That is horrible.
That hardly anyone has heard of. But I think probably describes a lot of the feeling around the United States at that time as well.
Round 2.
Rosanna?
Yes.
After hearing all these very, very upsetting things about the Tulsa race riot, what do you think is the next degree between Tulsa race riot and Damsel in Distress?
I think to get to Damsel in Distress, somehow we're going to have to hop over to, fiction or literature or something.
Okay.
But nothing I wrote down really connects to that. So I think I'm going to guess Prohibition.
Your guess of Prohibition is incorrect.
Okay.
Though that would have been a good one.
I thought so.
The next degree is still a little bit on the negative side. Okay, it's still completely on the negative side.
Okay, great.
It is racial violence in the United States.
Oh, Nikki. Oh, gosh.
I know.
Okay.
I couldn't help it. And listeners, I know this is kind of a downer, but I do think that these things are really important. And there are a lot of things that I had never heard of in this article. And we should know these things. I mean, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it.
That's true. I believe that.
I'm just going to go through some of the big ones.
Okay.
So, racial violence in the United States is just about mass racial violence, generally race riots. Here are some of the different events, which there's quite a spectrum here. I'm going to go by time period. We've got 1863 to 1939, which is the Reconstruction era. And just after, There was a lot of racially based community conflict, which is a really nice way to say a lynch mob. A lot of those happening in relation to slave revolts, then suppression of black voting and attempts to institute Jim Crow laws, which were segregation laws, and white supremacy. There were attacks on Native Americans over their land, which I think we've all heard of. Also, African Americans weren't alone in experiencing racial violence. By 1866, General William Sherman called for, quote, "At least 10 Indians are to be killed for each white life lost. You should not delay the punishment of the Indians as a people," end quote.
That's horrible. That's a horrible thing to say. Ugh.
I agree. But this was a man that had a lot of influence. The late 1800s, early 1900s, Italian immigrants were subject to racial violence a lot during this time. In 1891, 11 Italians were lynched by a mob of thousands in New Orleans, called the New Orleans lynchings. Now, as you thought I was talking about when we talked about the Tulsa race riot, the civil rights era, 1940 to 1971, there were, as you'd expect, frequent fighting among the various ethnic groups in major cities, specifically in the Northeast and Midwest United States. One example was explored in the stage musical West Side Story, which was about ethnic conflict in New York between Puerto Ricans and Italians. There was also mass violence and looting within African American, Mexican American, and Puerto Rican American communities during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. And the modern era, 1972 to present, racial violence has changed dramatically the way it's expressed. Open violent acts of racism they were rare. They seem to be becoming less rare over time.
Yeah.
But there are lots of acts of police brutality and mass incarceration of racial minorities. Those are big issues in the U.S., and some have led to riots around the country, like the Cincinnati riots of 2001 and the 2014 Ferguson unrest. Unrest seems like a soft way to put it.
Yeah, pretty tame.
That's what it was called. Interesting yet depressing fact, mass racial violence has been a part of the United States since its inception. Without question.
Round 3.
Okay, Rosanna?
Yeah.
Do you have a guess about the next degree between racial violence in the U.S. and damsel in distress?
I do. I was trying to pick something that was not sad. You didn't give me much to work with.
Hard to find in that article.
The least depressing thing was West Side Story. So that's my guess.
Okay. Your guess of West Side Story is correct.
Woohoo! Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's 2 for me. Rosanna, season 2, 2 points. Woo-hoo.
That's a lot of celebration.
Well, we're on episode 9, and this is my second one right.
So West Side Story, and we're talking about the stage musical. It was originally a book by Arthur Laurent, music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. It was inspired by William Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. There was also a movie from 1961. It's set in the Upper West Side neighborhood in New York City in the mid-1950s. And it explores the rivalry between the Jets and the Sharks, which are 2 teenage street gangs from different ethnic backgrounds. The Sharks are from Puerto Rico. They're taunted by the Jets, which is a white gang. It features young protagonist Tony, who used to be a member of the Jets, falls in love with Maria, the sister of Bernardo, the leader of the Sharks. So you can probably see a lot of parallels already between Romeo and Juliet and this play.
Yeah.
This musical. The plot is very similar to Romeo and Juliet, except Maria survives at the end. Spoiler. I mean, it's from 1950s, so I don't feel bad about spoiling the ending there. The original 1957 Broadway production ran for... How many performances do you think it ran for before it went on tour?
22.
732.
Whoa! That's way more.
That is a lot more.
Wow.
I have multiple interesting facts about West Side Story.
Okay.
The first draft of the musical focused on the conflict between an Irish Catholic family and a Jewish family living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan during the Easter Passover season.
Ah.
And it was called East Side Story.
Ah, of course it
Not
was.
West Side Story. They avoided slang expressions because they were afraid they'd be dated by the time their production opened, which is really smart.
Yeah.
So instead, Lawrence invented what sounded like street talk, but actually was not, like, quote, cut the frabba jabba. Just made up slang.
Frabba jabba.
Uh-huh.
I have to use that now.
And there's an upcoming film adaptation that's going to be directed by Steven Spielberg and written by Tony Kushner. It's going to start filming this year, 2019, and Ansel Elgort has been cast as Tony. You may recognize him from films like The Fault in Our Stars, Divergent, and Baby Driver. They've also done a bunch of casting of people of color that actually fit the cultural background of the characters.
What?
Which is great.
That is great and unusual.
I know. So unusual, but I'm really happy about it.
Round 4.
Okay, Rosanna, what's the next degree?
My original guess was going to be Romeo and Juliet, because that is literature.
It is.
And then I was like, well, maybe not, because maybe it's something else that's going to come around, or maybe it's just like Upper West Side, which is a place. Probably doesn't have damsels in distress there, though, because don't they have, like, money there? Isn't that where the money is?
I think so. I wouldn't know.
Yeah. I'm guessing it's probably not frabba jabba. I have a lot of weird stuff written down. I'm gonna go with my original thought, and I'm gonna guess Romeo and Juliet.
Okay. Your guess of Romeo and Juliet is correct again.
Oh my god, 2 in a row? 2 in a row!
2 in a row.
Yay!
This is unheard of.
It is! No, actually, I think you've done 2 in a row before. Haven't you?
Okay. It's been long enough that I don't remember.
It's unheard of for me. So who are these characters, Romeo and Juliet? I don't believe I've ever heard of them.
Romeo and Juliet was a stage play, a tragedy written by William Shakespeare early in his career, about 2 young star-crossed lovers whose deaths ultimately reconcile their feuding families. It was one of Shakespeare's most popular plays during his lifetime, along with Hamlet. It's also one of his most frequently performed plays. And today the title character is regarded as archetypal young lovers.
Dumb lovers, but whatever.
This story is not that original to Shakespeare.
Oh.
He did not make up this plot. Tragic romances have been around since antiquity. One of these is Pyramus and Thisbe from Ovid's Metamorphoses. The earliest known version of Romeo and Juliet of the tale, which is very much like Shakespeare's play, is the story of Mariotto and Giannazzi by Masuccio Salernitano. I don't know how to say any of that. I just said some letters together. And that was published in 1476.
Oh, so a while ago.
Shakespeare's were from the 1500s, so, he was a little late on this.
Yeah.
And the plot itself is based on an Italian tale translated into verse as The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet by Arthur Brooke in 1562. And retold in Palace of Pleasure by William Painter in 1567. So even the names weren't original, really.
Yeah. Come on, Shakespeare, get it together.
Yeah, he borrowed heavily from both. He also expanded the plot. He developed a whole bunch of supporting characters. You've probably heard of Mercutio and Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote it between 1591 and 1595. It was first published in a quarto version in 1597. Now here's a little synopsis of the actual play, the Shakespearean version. Set in Verona, Italy. Starts with a street brawl between Montague and Capulet's servants. And like their masters, they're sworn enemies. There's a huge feud in this city. Romeo goes to the ball at the Capulet house because he's trying to meet a woman named Rosaline that he was supposedly in love with. Instead, he meets and falls in love with Juliet.
Poor Rosaline.
So just switches one Capulet for another. After the ball, you get the balcony scene, very famous balcony scene, where Romeo sneaks into the Capulet orchard and overhears Juliet at her window, vowing her love to him in spite of her family's hatred for the Montagues. Very convenient timing. He makes himself known to her. They agree to get married. They get help from Friar Lawrence, because he wants to help reconcile the two families. And they get secretly married the next day. Not even 24 hours after meeting each other.
Elsa from Frozen would not approve.
Well, it's not even 24 hours after Romeo was in love with someone completely different.
Yeah, Romeo sounds like he's a mess.
Yes.
And Juliet sounds 14.
Yeah, I think she was 13 or something in this.
13 and 17 or 14 and 18 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, stupid.
There are duels, there are monologues. Mercutio has this amazing monologue. He also dies.
Spoiler alert from 1476.
Also, I always forget this part. Juliet was supposed to marry a guy named Paris. So she has to get out of this marriage. She gets a potion from Friar Lawrence that's supposed to make her comatose.
Yeah.
And the friar is going to tell Romeo so he can go find her in the family crypt. Then they can elope. Message gets lost. Text gets deleted. Romeo doesn't get the message. He finds her in the crypt, thinks she's actually dead, kills himself next to her. She wakes up, sees him dead, and commits suicide herself.
So dramatic.
Somehow this makes the families end their feud, which also seems unlikely after all this mess.
Mm-mm.
As you'd expect, there have been a lot of adaptations over the last 500 years. It's been adapted a whole bunch of times for the stage, for film, for musical, and opera venues. Our listeners are probably familiar with the Baz Luhrmann version, the 1996 MTV-inspired Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes.
That's a great movie.
David Garrick wrote a different version where he changed everything, mentioning Rosaline to Juliet, to make it seem more like Romeo was very faithful and downplay the whole love at first sight theme.
Ah.
And that was used for a long time. So I think a lot of people have never even heard of Rosaline. Interesting fact about Romeo and Juliet. Because women weren't allowed to act on stage when this play came out, Romeo and Juliet had been performed for over 60 years before a woman first played Juliet. It was all boys up until that point.
And it was Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yeah.
Round 5.
Right, Rosanna, what is the next degree between Romeo and Juliet and Damsel in Distress?
I wrote down so much stuff.
Okay.
And now that I'm going through it, I don't like any of it. I'm going back and forth between tragic romance and Verona.
Okay. Those are very different articles.
I'm going to pick Verona.
All right. Your guess of Verona is... Gotta break your streak. It's incorrect.
Ah, bummer.
But I think you're going to find the next degree pretty funny.
Okay, let's hear it.
The next degree is romance.
No, it's not!
Listeners, if you listened to our previous episode, one of the degrees was romance.
What
Here's
are
the thing.
chances?
Out of the thousands, maybe even millions of articles in Wikipedia, and because Rosanna and I record 2 episodes in the same evening...
What?
We ended up with one of the same degrees in our spirals right next to each other.
How is that possible?
The whole time you were going through that article in the last episode,
You're like, oh,
I was
deja vu.
I really hope we don't somehow end up at the same spot. Like, I know we have different ending degrees, but come on.
Oh my
This
gosh.
is crazy.
That's nuts.
But something else that's very interesting, I think, is that these articles are often so complex that Rosanna and I get different things out of them. I wrote down very different things than Rosanna did.
Well, yeah, if you didn't get to pseudo
We found different things interesting. Yeah, we wrote down very different things. So let's talk about romance.
Yeah, let's hear it.
As Rosanna said in the previous episode, romance is an emotional feeling of love or a strong attraction towards another person, and their courtship behaviors undertaken by an individual to express those feelings and emotions. The term romance originates from the medieval idea of chivalry, set out in chivalric romance literature. In Ladies of the Leisure class, Bonnie G. Smith, a Rutgers University professor, she described courtship and marriage rituals that may be viewed as oppressive toward modern people. She said, quote, "When the young women of the Nord married, they did so without illusions of love and romance. They acted within a framework of concern for the reproduction of bloodlines according to financial, professional, and sometimes political interests."
Wow.
End quote.
Very romantic.
Mm-hmm. That's how it was. Well, in the Middle Ages, marriage was generally nothing more than just a formal arrangement, which allowed for courtly love, which she talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly because there was a lack of emotional closeness between husband and wife in most cases. But lovers didn't necessarily mean people engaging in sexual acts. It was rather just emotional intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Which also I think modern people would have a problem with.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Definitely.
Interesting fact about romance. European medieval vernacular covered tales, epics, and ballads. And they generally dealt with chivalric adventures. They didn't bring in the concept of love itself until late into the 17th century. They were more just about the adventures that happened.
Round 6.
Right, Rosanna? What is the last degree between romance and damsel in distress?
I'm guessing it's not chivalry.
You probably have a leg up on this since you read the entire romance article. But we'll see.
I was so focused on chivalry when I read it. I don't remember even if damsel in distress was in the chivalry article. Could have been. Was it?
You tell me.
Can I take a quick Wikipedia research break?
Nope. Negatory, good buddy.
Well, I mean, I like chivalry because I used it, but I also like ballads.
Ah.
But I don't think that's right. I don't know. I don't know what it is.
You gotta make a guess. Now you know how I felt in the last round, in the last episode. Because I had read some of this stuff and I was so confused.
It's gotta be something about the stories. Like medieval literature. Is it medieval literature?
Oh. Is that your guess?
Yeah.
Your guess of medieval literature is incorrect.
All right.
Mostly.
Oh?
I think that might be worth like 25%.
Hey!
Of a correct answer.
Okay.
The next degree is chivalric romance.
What? No. What?
Which is a literary genre.
Okay. I mean, chivalry, I was like right there. Like, we were like at the same place. You were
very close. Mm-hmm.
So what is it? Chivalric
romance, which is a literary genre of high culture romance, chivalric romance.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's prose, verse narrative. It was really popular in the aristocratic circles of high medieval and early modern Europe.
I mean, I feel like it's probably really popular now to people that read romance novels.
Yes.
It's definitely a theme. Huh.
Here's the thing. I'm starting with the most interesting fact, which is that it was originally not romantic in the sense that it included a love story. It was more about quests. Some did include love stories, but not nearly all of them.
So the quest was the romance?
Yeah.
Okay.
The quest was the big thing about chivalric romances. They added courtly love elements to a lot of later stories, like King Arthur legends about Lancelot and Guinevere.
Mm-hmm.
But originally, it was just a genre about quests.
Seems like they should have called that something else. just my opinion.
So generally, these were fantastical stories, Marvel-filled adventures, usually of a chivalric knight-errant, portrayed as having heroic qualities, who goes on a quest. The modern image of medieval is more influenced by the romance than any other medieval genre. The word medieval evokes knights, damsels in distress, dragons, and other romantic tropes. And they were set apart from earlier epics. They had a heavy use of marvelous events, some elements of love sometimes, and often a web of interwoven stories rather than just a single plot running through the whole thing about a main character. Earliest forms were in verse. By the 15th century, many were written in prose, usually retelling the old rhymed versions. There were 3 separate categorizations. There was the Matter of Rome, which were centered on the life and deeds of Alexander the Great and the Trojan War. There was the Matter of France, which included Charlemagne and Roland, his principal paladin. The Matter of Britain, which included the lives and deeds of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And that was incorporated into the quest for the Holy Grail. And medieval authors said that this comprised all romances. It did not.
No.
There were definitely chivalric romances in other cultures, and not just Rome, France, and Britain. Another interesting fact, chivalric romances almost always included magical elements like fairies and wizards. And this continued and got more focused after 1760, when romances started getting gothic influences and got eerie elements like ghosts and supernatural beings, like Dracula. And that's when they started getting closer to our current romance novels you've definitely heard of. And that takes us to Damsel in Distress, also known as a persecuted maiden or princess in jeopardy. It's a classic theme in literature, art, film, and video games. Most notably in those that have a lot of action, hence the quests. Usually involves beautiful, innocent, or helpless young female leads, put in some sort of dire predicament by a villain or a monster or an alien. They require a male hero to achieve rescue.
Train tracks.
Yep. Usually these women are stereotyped as really physically weak and just completely dependent on the male lead. After being rescued, they often marry the hero. Because that's the first thing you think of when you've been in a traumatic situation is getting hitched to the person who helped you.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes it kind of is, but that kind of emotion doesn't last.
No. This is not Speed, the movie.
Exactly.
So the damsel in distress has become just a stock character in fiction. Usually she's human, not always. And it can sometimes be a divine figure like an angel, a spirit, or a deity. The English term damsel in distress first appears, as far as we know, in Richard Ames's 1692 poem Sylvia's Complaint of Her Sex's Unhappiness.
Okay.
I've got some examples for you of damsels in distress.
Okay.
They were featured a lot in stories from the ancient Greeks. Greek mythology had a lot of competent goddesses, but a lot of helpless maidens threatened with sacrifice. So very different kinds of women there in those stories.
Yeah.
European fairy tales had a whole bunch of damsels in distress. Evil witches trapped Rapunzel in a tower. Snow White was cursed to die. Sleeping Beauty was put into a magical sleep. All are saved by a prince that they then marry. In the 19th century, there was Victorian stage melodrama that had just a really limited number of stock characters. The hero, the villain, the heroine, an old man, an old woman, a comic man, and a comic woman. And they all were in this sensational plot that had themes of love and murder. And usually the hero was good but not very smart.
Yep.
And he was duped by a villain who wanted the damsel in distress until fate intervened. Not that he was smart enough to save her, but fate helped him save her.
Right.
And then he probably married her.
A poor dumb hero.
Still gets the girl in the end, apparently. In the early 19th century, we got silent films. And that's when we got new perils because of the Industrial Revolution, like the railroad track, as you mentioned. Women tied to a railroad track are stuck in a burning building or around explosions. And in the 20th century, we got stage magic, where attractive female assistants were restrained and imperiled with blades and spikes. And this just became a staple of magicians' acts. And those are all their degrees. We went from Tulsa race riot to racial violence in the United States, to West Side Story, to Romeo and Juliet, to romance, to chivalric romance, to damsel in distress. Rosanna, what did you think of this spiral?
Well, I was a bit shocked. Because we had the same degree, which has never happened before. I like that it came in the February spiral. That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I got 2 degrees right, which is a personal record.
Yeah, that was really good. It's time for Whim of the Week. Our whim this week is a recommendation for a show and a book series called The Magicians. Now, Rosanna, have you read these books or watched the show?
I have read the books. I have not seen the show.
I've read the books and watched the show, and I love them both.
The books are very good.
They are very good. They're by author Lev Grossman. I've heard them described as Harry Potter for grown-ups. I think that's selling it short. There is a lot of magic. It's very, very involved. It actually takes some energy to do. You don't just have unlimited magic like Harry Potter does. But the themes can get pretty adult in these books. They're definitely not for children. I'd say young adult at the minimum. Even then, there are some scenes that can be tough. Tough to read. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a young adult to read them. But they're hugely entertaining, very original. They're really great. And the show, I think, is a great interpretation of it. I believe the first 3 seasons are available on Netflix right now. And the first season isn't too far from the books, but after that, it really breaks apart. But unlike so many series that have very different plot lines from the source material, the writers are fantastic. And the plot lines that they introduce that are completely different from the books are wonderful, and they feel true to the original story and the original characters. And the casting is just phenomenal. It's just so much fun and so entertaining to watch. And Margot is my spirit animal. She will forever be the person I want to be. She's amazing. So I definitely recommend reading the books, watching the show. You can enjoy them both, even if, sometimes you don't like to watch adaptations of things, just because they are different enough, I think, to enjoy completely separately. Highly recommend The Magicians.
I guess what I would say about the book series, I've heard it described as Harry Potter for adults too, and I think a better description would be, if you are an adult and you enjoyed the Harry Potter books, you'll probably enjoy this as a more mature story.
Yes.
Not that it is Harry Potter grown up. It's its own story.
I think that's a good differentiation.
They're great books. Very good. I'd recommend them also. We have a couple more things we're going to read a review. And also we would like to thank Justine from the Cutaways podcast. She is our most recent patron on Patreon. Thank you, Justine, for joining. We're so grateful for your support.
Thanks, Justine.
If you're interested in being a patron for the show, go to patreon.com/6degreesofwiki.
And we have a review straight from Twitter from @NewtonsDarkRoom. And this is someone who heard about us at PodCon 2 that we attended in January and had a really great time at.
We really did.
They say, it is one of the cleanest concepts out there, well executed, and a real ride to follow along with. 10 out of 10 would recommend.
Such a nice review.
Which is a fantastic review. Thank you so much for that. Listeners, if you leave a review, we will read it on air. Even if you don't like us, you can tell us what you hate. And
Please
we'll
do.
tell you why you're wrong.
Yep, we will.
Or maybe we'll agree with you. I don't know. Just depends on what you say.
We're open to constructive criticism and suggestions.
Yes.
Yes.
That's our episode. Tune in next time for another 6 Degrees of Wiki. Keep up with us at 6degreesofwiki.com and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to let us know what you think.
Looking for early access to episodes and bonus content like bloopers? Go to patreon.com to become a 6 Degrees of Wiki patron and get discounts on merch or even help us choose degrees. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Dig-a-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da.